Welcome back to today's reaction video. In this episode, we take a closer look at the controversial topic of the Satanic Verses. David Wood walks us through the passages that were reportedly inserted by Satan, not from Allah, which included words of praise for 3 pagan goddesses as intercessors. We'll be breaking down the history, the claims, and the implications behind this event.
Was preaching
so
in
stay
Mecca.
tuned for a detailed discussion.
When Muhammad was preaching in Mecca, he didn't win a ton of converts. The mass conversions came later on. But when Muhammad's preaching in Mecca, did not win a ton of converts, and the Muslim community is being persecuted and so on. And Muhammad was longing for a revelation that would help win his tribe to him. And he really wanted his tribe to join him so that he could have help in conquering Arabia. That was already part of the plan back then. So he was longing for a revelation that would help his people convert to Islam. And eventually he got the revelation that he was looking for. These words were originally part of Surah 53 of the Qur'an. You get to a part that mentions al-Lat, al-Uzza, and Manat. Here's what it says. Have you not heard of al-Lat and al-Uzza and Manat, the third, the other? These are the exalted cranes whose intercession is to be hoped for. So al-Lat, al-Uzza, and Manat were 3 pagan goddesses. And the idea here is these are the exalted cranes, meaning they thought of intercessors as these like bird goddesses. So the idea is that, yes, Allah is the main God, but it's okay to pray to pagan goddesses because they're your intercessors. They will carry your prayers up to Allah. You're familiar with the sources. When Allah wants to hear your prayers, he has to travel down and get close and to listen to your prayers. Well, why not pray to these pagan goddesses and they just carry your prayers up to Allah, and Allah doesn't have to do so much traveling. So Muhammad eventually got this revelation. He delivered this revelation to his followers, and he bowed down in honor of the revelation. Then his followers bowed down in honor of the revelation, and then the polytheists also bowed down. They were overjoyed that Muhammad had spoken favorably of their goddesses. But a little later, he comes back and says, sorry, the devil made me do it. The devil tricked me into delivering these revelations. And so he came back, and then Surah 53 does not say this. It says something different now. But this is what Surah 53 originally said. So Satan tricked him into promoting polytheism. Muslims today almost universally reject the story of the Satanic Verses. Interestingly, it's because of a theological shift that happened in the early centuries of Islam. But in the early centuries of Islam, this was just taken for granted. This was known to be true. And later on, they changed their theology. And after they changed their theology, then they rule out the story as something that couldn't have happened. It's too embarrassing for them. So this isn't something that was invented centuries after the time of Muhammad. This goes back to the 1st century of Islam. The next thing historians would be looking for, multiple sources. So if you just have one source, well, it may be true. And if it's a very trustworthy person, you might trust the testimony of just one person. But in general, the more sources, the merrier. Like if you have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 sources or something like that, then that's stronger from a historical perspective. Now, when we're talking about the Satanic Verses, our historical records of the Satanic Verses, we're not talking about one source or 2 sources or 5 sources or 10 sources or 20.
Notice how the video frames the whole situation, as if Muhammad himself was fully aware that these words were not from Allah, and yet still went ahead and declared them. The implication here is very striking, because it presents him not as someone misled unknowingly, but as someone who consciously delivered words he knew were not divine.
20 sources even. Shahab Ahmed, in his doctoral dissertation again, he had 37 sources on the Satanic Verses. By the time his book was published after his death, he had 50 Muslim sources on the Satanic Verses. So of the 50 sources that were included in Shahab Ahmed's book. 7 go back to Ka'b al-Kharazi, one of Islam's great early Quran scholars. 6 go back to Urwa ibn al-Zubair, early Meccan scholar who's known as the founder of the study of the life of Muhammad. He was also Aisha's nephew, Abu Bakr's grandson, and the son of Abu Bakr's daughter, Asma, who was one of the first 20 converts to Islam. 5 go back to Abu Aliya al-Basri, another of the greatest Quran scholars of the first century of Islam. He studied the Quran with Caliph Umar, Ubay ibn Ka'b, Zayd ibn Thabit, and Ibn Abbas. 2 go back to al-Sudi, another early scholar who studied with Ibn Abbas. Ibn Abbas is Muhammad's cousin. 3 reports go back to Qatada ibn Diyama, one of Islam's greatest early Quran commentators. 2 go back to Abu Bakr ibn Abdul Rahman ibn al-Harith, one of the top scholars of Islamic law during the first century of Islam. 1 comes from the tafsir of Ibn al-Sa'ib al-Kalbi, an early commentator who composed the longest tafsir, commentary on the Quran, that had been written up until his time. 1 goes back to al-Dahak ibn Muzahim al-Balki, a first century expert in tafsir. 4 go back to Muqatil ibn Sulaiman, an early Quran scholar who wrote the earliest surviving complete tafsir of the Quran. 3 go back to Mujahid ibn Jabr, who was a student of Ibn Abbas and was called during his lifetime the most learned man alive in tafsir. 1 goes back to Ikrimah, a slave of Ibn Abbas and an expert on the life of Muhammad. We have 10 reports that go back to Muhammad's cousin Ibn Abbas himself, the founder of Quranic studies. We have 3 that go back to Sa'id ibn Jubair, one of the leading Quranic scholars of his time and one of the top students of Ibn Abbas. Some of Ibn Abbas's narratives go through Sa'id ibn Jubair, but some of them are from Sa'id ibn Jubair himself. It's a ton of sources. If you wanted to say they made it up, it's a situation, okay, Ibn Abbas and why are all these guys simultaneously making up a story about Muhammad receiving a revelation and being duped by Satan? Why would people make up a story about Muhammad not being able to tell the difference between a revelation from God and a revelation from Satan? I mean, for me, that would call the entire religion into question. Why would you make that up? So until some good explanation of why they would make all of this up arises, really looks like this is something that happened. And so we have the great Oxford scholar Guillaume. So if you've heard of it, the English translation of Ibn Ishaq, that's Guillaume is the one who translated that. But he says, it is impossible to suggest a motive that would induce the early Muslims to write such a story about the prophet unless it were true. If historical evidence is to be given any value, we must hold that Muhammad pronounced these words in the middle of Surah 53. And Montgomery Watt concludes, Muhammad must have publicly recited the Satanic verses as part of the Quran. It is unthinkable that the story could have been invented by Muslims or foisted upon them by non-Muslims. So if you're going to say, no, someone must have made this up. Someone made up this story. Okay, who? Muslims or non-Muslims? If it's Muslims, why are a bunch of Muslims getting together and making up a story about their prophet being tricked by Satan? Why would they make that up? Or if you're saying non-Muslims invented this story, okay, if a bunch of non-Muslims come up to Muhammad's companions and so on and say, hey, did you know your prophet delivered a revelation from the devil? Why are the Muslims going to accept that and pass that on? If it didn't happen, they'd be going, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? His companions were there during this time. We didn't see this. What are you talking about? So the best by far explanation for why we have so much information on this coming from Muslims themselves is, like it or not, it happened and they recorded it early on. So here's an isnad that goes from Ibn Mardawayh all the way back to Ibn Abbas, a companion of Muhammad. And so you've got that's the chain there. Notice it goes all the way to Ibn Abbas at the end. So I got it from so-and-so, got it from so-and-so, got it from so-and-so, got it from so-and-so, all the way back to Ibn Abbas. So that's a chain. So what excuse do Muslims have for rejecting this? Well, everyone on this list is reliable, but there's one person that people just don't know much about. They don't have a lot of information on Muhammad ibn Ali here. So we don't have any reason not to trust him, but Muslims are kind of looking for any excuse to reject this chain. So since we don't have a lot of records about this guy, they would say, we can conclude that we can't trust the story that came from it. It's an interesting way of doing history, but let's look at another one. So here's another Isnad chain. Again, going all the way back to Ibn Abbas. But what's wrong with this chain? Everyone in this chain is reliable. And you've got the connection going all the way back to a companion of Muhammad. But one of the scribes who transmitted the story said he had doubts. He had doubts about whether this story was true. And so if you were ever to bring this up to a scholar, your average Muslim is going to have no clue what you're talking about here if you bring this up. But if a Muslim scholar who studies this issue, if you were to bring this up, he would say, but one of the scribes who transmitted it said it's unreliable. He didn't say it was unreliable because of anyone on the list. He thought it was unreliable because it's about Muhammad receiving a revelation from the devil. And so just think about that, right? It meets the criteria of the Hadith scholars here, but they'll just say, well, this is too embarrassing. A scribe said this is too embarrassing to actually be true. And then Muslims today will use that. You see, this story can't be true. Well, it meets your criteria. You're just saying you don't like it at this point. It's a really big problem for Muhammad. And here's one reason why. So Deuteronomy 18:20, I love this specifically because it's 2 verses after their main prophecy about Muhammad in the Old Testament. So Surah 18, verse 18, they quote that. That's where God says he's going to send a prophet like Moses. And they say, see, that's Muhammad. Muhammad is the prophet like Moses. Deuteronomy 18:18 is a prophecy about Muhammad. Go 2 verses later. But the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name that I have not commanded him to speak, or speaks in the name of other gods, that same prophet shall die. So if you are promoting polytheism, belief in other gods, you would have to die. You are a false prophet. And if you delivered a revelation that did not come from God, you said it's from God, you are a false prophet. One more issue, and by the way, there are many more issues. For instance, it's a little side issue, but it's one of my favorite interesting little things. But the story of the Satanic Verses was about these bird intercessors. You got bird goddesses who will carry your prayers up to Allah and intercede for you. When you look at some of the issues that were going on in paganism, you see Muhammad is trying to replace paganism with an Islamic alternative. It's in the Hadith. Muhammad said that at the judgment, chapters of the Qur'an are going to appear as flocks of birds, and they're going to intercede for Muslims. So chapters of the Qur'an, Surah 2 is going to show up as a flock of birds. And the idea is that it's a flock because I guess individual birds are individual verses or something like that. But he said that flocks of birds are going to show up to intercede for Muslims. I mean, think about that. Why would chapters of the Quran appear as flocks of birds? Think about the mentality of the pagans. Allah's way up there. You need birds to carry prayers up there. And what's interesting is if you talk about the story of the Satanic Verses, any Muslim on the planet would recognize belief in the exalted cranes, al-Lat, al-Uzza, Manat, as total paganism. What? You've got these intercessors who are doing this work and so on, and they're conscious agents who are interceding for you and so on. You believe in these things and you're talking to them. Then you find out in later Islam, the chapters of the Quran are the exact same thing. They're your intercessors and they're interceding with Allah for you. Well, it sounds like all you did was replace these goddesses with these chapters of the Quran, which do the exact same thing. And somehow that won't be paganism. So if you say it's a bird goddess who's carrying my prayers up to Allah or something like that, interceding for me, total paganism. If you could just call it Surah al-Baqarah doing it, that's totally fine. So al-Uzza, bad. Surah al-Baqarah, totally fine, doing the exact same thing. It's weird system, but it looks like Muhammad's just taking the beliefs of the pagans and saying, here's the Islamic way of doing the exact same thing. But here, Muhammad, there's a verse of the Quran that was revealed in response to the Satanic Verses. So Muhammad was told by Gabriel, what are you doing? You delivered revelations from the devil. You fell for it. What's wrong with you? And Muhammad felt really, really bad, and he was totally miserable and depressed because he had fallen for this. And then Allah consoled him with Surah 22, verse 52, where he says, don't worry, Muhammad. We did not send before you any apostle or prophet. But when he desired, the shaitan, Satan, made a suggestion respecting his desire. But Allah annuls that which the shaitan cast. Then does Allah establish his communications, and Allah is knowing wise. Look at what he said. What's he say here? Don't worry, Muhammad. All prophets do this. All prophets, when they're receiving revelations, are duped by Satan, and Satan gives them some words, and then they think it's from God, but it's actually from Satan. But don't worry, because Allah comes back and fixes it later, and then he establishes what his real communications are. So in order to make Muhammad feel better, Allah has to tell him, don't worry, all prophets deliver revelations from the devil from time to time. This is a guy you want to trust. He's not just justifying his own blunder. He's now attributing the exact same blunder to all the prophets who came before him. So one big slap in the face to all prophets from a prophet who said that, hey, we respect all prophets in Islam. Oh, really? And yet they all fall for revelations from the devil. Anyway, that's where we'll be going in the very near future. Using the Satanic Verses, there are tons of ways. But again, the main issue here is Muhammad's promoting polytheism, which, by the way, what's the worst possible sin in Islam? Shirk. So Muhammad, keep in mind, Muhammad committed shirk. He convinced his followers to commit shirk. And he promoted shirk even among the pagans, because they all loved these verses about al-Lat, al-Uzza, and Manat. So you're telling me that the greatest prophet committed the worst possible sin and convinced his followers to commit the worst.
Before you click away, I want you to really pause and think about this. If Muhammad once spoke words that were not from Allah, what assurance is there that it couldn't happen again? That's not just a small detail to overlook. It raises a serious question about reliability, trust, and truth itself. If even one moment of weakness or deception slipped in, how can anyone be fully certain it won't repeat? This is why it's so important to look deeper, to question, and to seek what truly comes from God. Don't just take my word for it. Reflect on it yourself. If it happened once, what would stop it from happening again?